Hello everyone. Tonight, I've got a batch of chilling tales to share with you. But before we dive in, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me keep creating even better content. Now, sit back, relax, and join me as we embark on this eerie journey together. I hadn't owned a car since college, so when I saw the Craigslist ad offering a 2008 sedan free must pick up by end of day, I thought, why not? It sounded too good to be true, but I'd been saving money on Uber and a free car. Even an old one couldn't hurt. I emailed the poster and arranged to haul it away that evening. The address was in a rundown industrial park on the city's edge. I pulled up in my compact hatchback to a cracked asphalt lot where one lone sedan sat beneath a flickering street lamp. It was a black Mercury Sable, dented dull paint, a windshield spider-webbed with cracks. My heart sank, but free was free. I hopped out and called the number. "Hey, it's outside," I said. A gravelly voice crackled back. "Good, hurry up." I popped the hood, no obvious leaks or missing parts. I shook the doors locked. I circled to the back and slipped the key the seller had left taped under the bumper. The lock clicked. I opened the driver's door and slid inside. The upholstery was snag-stained with old coffee rings, but everything seemed functional. So I climbed in, turned the ignition, and it roared to life. An odd chill rushed over me, as if the engine's hum had woken something slumbering. I shrugged it off and revved the throttle. The lights flared, then dimmed, flicker before settling. I eased the car onto the street, fumbling with the stick shift. In the rearview mirror, I saw no lot behind me, only darkness. I pressed the brake. The lot reappeared yellow light and broken chain link fence. Must be my imagination. I flipped the headlights on and pulled onto the main road, the car's engine vibrating under me. On the drive home, I noticed the radio was stuck on one station, a local talk station that was long defunct. The host's voice crackled. And when you get behind the wheel of your used car, you never know who's coming along for the ride. The broadcast repeated in loops, the host's tone growing more manic each cycle. I reached to switch stations, no change. I slapped the dash. Still that same recording, but distorted now, warped the host's voice, twitching between male and female, youthful and ancient. I rolled down the window. The night air rushed in, carrying a faint hiss, like hundreds of tiny voices whispering all at once. They were too low to discern, but when the voices rose, I felt them pressing against my mind, clamoring to be heard. My pulse spiked. I drove faster, hoping to outrun the car's strange static. At a red light, I glanced at the passenger seat empty, but I swore I saw a shape slump there. When I turned my head, white sheet draped over something like a covered body. I whipped back to the mirror. Nothing. At home, I parked in my garage and shut the door. I sat behind the wheel, hands shaking on the wheel. The voices faded. The radio went silent. The shape on the passenger seat vanished. The engine idled smoothly. I convinced myself it was stress. Maybe the car's alternator was dying, messing with the radio. I nodded to myself and forced a smile. Tomorrow, I'd take it to a mechanic. That night, I set the alarm on my phone and climbed into bed. I slept deeply until around 3 a.m., when a tapping sound jolted me awake. My phone buzzed on the bedside table, a notification that my garage door had opened. My heart lurched. I slipped out of bed and peered through the gap in the curtains. The driveway was empty. No headlights. No black sedan. I crept downstairs, clutching my phone like a talisman. At the basement door, the tapping grew louder. Tap, tap, tap. Metal on metal. I flicked on the light, my old door key rattling in the lock from the other side. It turned slowly. Then the door swung inward. Without a hand on the knob, I stifled a scream, backed away, and flicked the light on in the garage. There it sat, waiting engine, running door open wide. The back seat door creaked as if someone had just climbed out. I froze. I stepped forward. The interior lamp was illuminated, casting thin shadows. I peered in at the passenger seat. At first glance, it was empty. Then I saw it, a single leather glove, pale and delicate, laid palm up on the seat. The fingers were too long for a man's glove and too narrow for a woman's. I swallowed. "Hello," I whispered. No answer. Only the engine's soft purr and the distant hum of the blinking garage light. I reached for the glove, pressing my thumb into its leather. It was ice cold. Goosebumps prickled my skin. I yanked my hand back and closed the door. The engine died with a shudder. Up, heart pounding against my ribs. I grabbed my keys from the peg by the door. My apartment key, the old hatchback key. No remote for the Sable. I sprinted up the stairs, slammed the basement door, and locked it from the inside. My phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. Forgot something. My blood ran cold. I looked at the message screen. No reply number. Just the text lingering on my home screen. I backed away from my phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher picked up after several rings. I stammered out my situation. Anonymous car. Strange voices in the radio messages on my phone. She hesitated, then said, "We'll send an officer to check your property." I sank to the floor, phone pressed to my ear, waiting. The tapping began again from the basement door. Tap, tap, tap. Then the metal frame of the door groaned as if something was trying to push it open from the other side. My heart thundered. The door handle rattled. I whispered into the phone. "They're here." Then the line went dead. Click. Silence filled the garage. Then the last hinge squeaked and the door swung inward just a crack. Darkness poured through. I bolted upright, vaulted over the couch, and ran for the back exit, only to find it locked. I jerked my keychain. My keys wouldn't turn in the lock. Behind me, the door in the basement swung open fully, and a figure emerged, tall, draped in a long coat, face hidden in shadow. The nightlight from the hallway glinted off something in its gloved hand. I scrambled to the front door. The knob clicked and turned easily this time. I burst outside into the cool night air. The sedan sat in the driveway, headlights off. The stranger climbed in through the passenger door, stirring the leather seat. I yanked the driver's door open, threw myself inside, and slammed it. With a twist of the key under the dash, though I'd never found the ignition key, it roared to life. I drove out of my own driveway, the sedan responding with uncanny smoothness. The road stretched before me, empty under the glare of streetlights. I sped away, headlights illuminating the cracked pavement, and didn't look back. Later, when I finally revisited the listing, it had vanished. No trace of the address, no record of the post, no contact number. I ran a license plate search on my old hatchback, nothing. Now, every time I pass that junction in the industrial walk, I glance at the lot where the car once sat, wondering if it and whatever rode inside will ever come back for me. because I know it's still out there waiting for someone desperate enough to drive it off the lot and take its passenger home. I'd always loved collecting vintage toys. There was something nostalgic about the chipped paint and cotton-stuffed seams. So when I spotted the Craigslist listing for an antique porcelain doll, I couldn't resist. Antique German porcelain doll, $20, face chips, dress torn as is. The photos showed her pale face cracked, right cheek, glass eyes that caught the light. Perfect for my display shelf. I messaged the seller immediately. She lived in a bungalow 2 towns over. When I arrived, the yard was cluttered with broken lawn ornaments and rusted tricycles. The front door creaked open before I could knock. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and something else, old sugar sour. The living room shelves were jammed with dolls, bisque-headed celluloid cloth rag dolls, all staring blankly. An elderly woman, hunched in a rocking chair, motioned me forward. "She's over here," she whispered. I followed her past rows of dolls to a small side table where the porcelain girl sat propped against a cushion. She wore a fraying lace dress and her dark hair was matted. I picked her up carefully. The tiny weight of her head was unsettling. "Perfect condition for my collection," I said, slipping the doll into my car's passenger seat. Back home, I set her on a glass shelf with my other toys. That night, I lay awake imagining how beautiful she'd look with rosy new cheeks. When I finally dozed off, I dreamed of her moving tiny porcelain footsteps, tapping on hardwood, her glass eyes following me through the dark. The next morning, I found her, lying face down on the carpet. My head spun. Why would I have moved her? I knelt to pick her up. Her eyes were smeared with dust, but one cheek looked freshly chipped, a tiny crescent missing, as if someone had bitten it. I ran my fingertip over the jagged edge, cold and sharp. I checked the shelf. Nothing else had moved. Shrugging, I dusted her off and propped her upright again, forcing a laugh. Dolls can tip over, no big deal. That night, around 2 a.m., I heard a soft giggle, like a little girl's laugh, coming from my office. I slipped from bed into the dark hallway, following the sound to the shelf. The doll was gone. My heart hammered as I scanned the table. She sat on the floor, eyes fixed on me. I knelt and reached out. The giggle stopped. Silence. I returned her to the shelf, hands trembling. As I straightened her lace dress, I noticed the cracks on her forehead had expanded overnight, fine hairs of fracture spreading out like spider legs. The next day, I invited a friend over to admire the doll. As we chatted in the living room, her phone buzzed with a news alert. Breaking: local toddler dies in hit and run tonight. We stared at each other. My friend opened the article. A 2-year-old from my neighborhood had been struck and killed near her home at 10:30 p.m. last night, just after I'd gone to bed. My stomach turned. I excused myself, but my friend followed. "You okay?" she asked. I pointed at the doll on the shelf. That laugh. I heard it last night just before the accident. Her eyes widened. "Put it away," she said softly. "Now." I locked the doll in a plastic container and stashed it in the closet. That evening, I lay in bed, mind racing with guilt. I drifted off, only to be awakened by the sound of tiny sobs, sniffles, like a child's tears. I stumbled into the closet, yanked open the door, and shone my phone's flashlight. The container lay on its side. The lid was off. The doll sat next to it, hair matted, face smudged. She stared up at me, tears of black resin streaking down her cheeks. Her mouth twisted into a mournful frown. I recoiled, heart pounding. I grabbed the container and slammed the closet door, barricading it with hangers and shoes. I slept in the living room that night, the doll locked away, but I could still hear her sobbing behind the door. Over the next few days, I tried to ignore it. Work friends' daily routine, but at every turn I felt watched. My reflection in windows seemed to flicker with a small girl standing behind me. I started finding tiny footprints in dust on the floor, barely 3 inches long, leading from the closet to my bedroom door and back. Then came the knocks. It was always 3 gentle taps. Tap, 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 at my bedroom door around midnight. I'd wake heart racing and call out, "Who's there?" The knocks stopped. I never heard a reply, only the sound of tiny scratchings from beneath the door. I knew I had to get rid of her. One rainy evening, I drove to the outskirts of town, determined to bury the doll in a wooded area. My hands shook as I dug a shallow hole beneath a twisted oak. I placed her in the damp earth, covered her with soil, and patted it down. I promised, "You're gone now." I left without looking back. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in weeks. But at 3:13 a.m., I jolted awake to the sound of giggling and the dull thud of porcelain hitting hardwood. I sat up. The bedroom door was open. The giggling grew louder, echoing in the hall. My bare feet hit the floor. I ran toward the sound, adrenaline surging. In the living room, where the doll had lived, I found her not in the closet, not in the overgrown grave, but seated on the sofa dress, clean hair untangled. My sight pristine again. In her porcelain hand, she held a small muddy shovel. Her glass eyes glowed with triumph. She giggled and rocked the shovel in her lap. Ice filled my veins. I backed away, stumbling over the ottoman. "Get out!" I hissed. "Get out of my house!" The doll's giggle warped into a chuckle. She stood, porcelain knees clicking. She raised that tiny shovel and drew a long line in the carpet, like carving a doorway in the wall. The shadow beneath it flickered, widening. I ran past her through the front door into the rain. I turned back through the rain-speckled window. I saw her standing on the sill, that cracked face smiling. Behind her, the carpet seam ripped open like a mouth, revealing inky blackness within. I don't know what I opened that night, but I know she was waiting for me on the other side. I sped away, never looking back, leaving her in the dark frame of the window. Now in my apartment, every reflective surface shows a pale girl holding a shovel. I cover my mirrors, but at night, I still hear the faintest tapping tap. Tap, tap, as if she's digging her way back in. I'd almost passed over the listing free antique upright piano U-Haul, but the price was right, and I'd always loved the look of old instruments. My apartment had an empty corner, begging for something grand. I emailed the poster, and by that afternoon, I was at a narrow cul-de-sac on the edge of town. The house looked abandoned. Peeling paint, overgrown lawn. A curtain fluttering in a front window, like a pale warning flag. I rang the bell. No answer. I knocked harder this time and heard scuffling inside. The door creaked open on cracked hinges. "You, the piano guy?" asked a gaunt man in a threadbare cardigan, his eyes dark hollows. He slipped aside wordlessly and pointed to the side yard. There, half hidden by brambles, stood the piano. Its ebony paint flaking one leg splintered the top, propped open like a yawning mouth. I ran my hand over the keys. They felt cold, sticky with grime. The man watched silently as I tested a few notes. Every tone sounded slightly flat mournful, as if the piano were sighing. "It's yours, if you take it now," he rasped. "Don't bring it back." He handed me a ragged sheet, as is no warranty. "Take responsibility." I signed it because I didn't want to disappoint. We hefted the piano onto a rented dolly and navigated it down the broken steps. The instrument weighed a ton, but eventually I managed to wrestle it into my living room. It sat there awkward and imposing, like a dark promise. That night, after a pizza I never finished, I sat before the piano and pressed middle C. The note cracked like glass. I frowned and tried D, same result. I sighed, looked at the worn sheet music I'd found in the piano bench, a composition titled Lullaby for Elise. I recognized the name, but the melody was different, slower, twisted, dissonant. Curious, I played the first bars. At first, it sounded beautiful, a tender, drifting tune. But halfway through the notes, warped shrilling, then plunging into a hollow, lower register that rattled the floorboards. I slammed the lid shut, heart racing. The next evening, I returned to find the piano keys dusted clean, as if someone had wiped them. I drew back the lid. The sheet music lay face down on the bench, the ragged edges curling. I flipped it over. There in jagged black ink, someone had scrawled a new verse beneath the original. "Here I linger when you sleep, knocking soft to claim my keep." Beneath it was a handprint in faded red, like dried paint or something darker. I stared until the room spun. I tore the page out and crumpled it, but a cold wind rustled the curtains behind me. I spun nothing. A hum. That night, I dreamed of piano keys playing themselves. My fingers hovered over the air, and the room filled with that warped lullaby. A silhouette hovered behind me, tall, featureless, its hands hovering just above the keys. I woke to a scraping sound, like fingernails on wood. The clock read 3:17 a.m. I grabbed my glasses and padded to the living room. Through the dim glow of the street lamp outside, I saw the piano lid raised and keys depressed one by one, playing those mournful chords. I crept forward, heart in my throat, and the music stopped. Silence roared. Then the lid slammed shut on its own, and the room went cold. I rushed back to the bench and pried it open. Inside, I found a small wooden doll shattered into pieces, one leg, one arm. Shards of a painted porcelain face. Beneath the fragments, a yellowed photograph. A smiling little girl in a white dress standing beside that same piano in a brighter room. I held it to the light and saw scribbled on the back one word, mine. I fell asleep in my armchair, clutching the photo. When I woke, the doll pieces were gone. So was the photo. In their place, on the bench, lay a new scrap, a child's fingertip-length ribbon tied in a bow. Its color was stained deep crimson. I wanted to throw the piano out, but how it barely fit through the door. I called a friend with a truck. He agreed to take it away the next morning. Good riddance. That afternoon, I practiced the strange lullaby one last time so I could erase it from my mind. I opened the lid and sat at the bench, but before I could play the keys, depressed in a single sweeping motion, and a voice breathed from the bench. "Stay." I yanked back, nearly falling off the stool. The voice was soft, childish, mournful. I backed away, staring at the piano. The bench popped open on its own, revealing a small trapdoor under the seat. My brain spun. I knelt and pried it open, flashing my phone light inside. A narrow compartment carved into the wood held a small porcelain eye, the same gray glass as the girl in the photo. And beside it, a scrap of lace from her dress. A low sob echoed in the room as if someone wept behind the walls. I dropped the eye and slammed the trapdoor shut. My fingers trembled. That evening, my friend arrived. We hauled the piano down to the street. As he tilted it onto his truck, the lid snapped open with a crack like a gunshot. The bench flew out, wood splintering. My friend jumped back. On the exposed keys high above the open lid stood the little girl in the photo. Her dress, clean face, pale glass eyes fixed on me. She raised one tiny hand and pointed, and the keys pressed themselves in a sweeping glissando that shrieked through the night, drowning out the traffic. My friend fled, leaving me alone with her song. She vanished, and the piano settled into stillness. The street was silent, too silent. I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. I forced a nod to my friend across the asphalt, and he drove off, truck roaring into the darkness without me. Now, the piano sits in my living room, front and center. I couldn't bring myself to unload it. Instead, I cover it with a dusty tarp. But at night, I hear those notes whispering through the fabric, and I know she's still inside waiting for my song. Sometimes I lift the cover and catch a faint glimpse of tiny fingers curled above a key. And when I'm brave enough to look, she tilts her head, smiles, and begins again. Here I linger when you sleep, knocking soft to claim my keep. I almost didn't reply to the listing. Original oil, portrait 15, free pickup. But I've been restoring old homes for clients, and sometimes I snatch up odd decor to test cleaning techniques. The photo showed a gaunt gentleman in tails seated before a stormy seascape, eyes like dark stone's mouth set in a thin line. The frame was chipped, the canvas brittle, and I thought perfect project. I arranged to pick it up that Saturday. The address was a narrow row house that leaned into its neighbor. I found the door ajar and stepped inside. The foyer was crowded with dust-choked furniture and stacks of yellowing newspapers. I called out, but there was no answer. I climbed the stairs to the parlor where the portrait hung, its glass broken, the frame askew. A woman stood in the corner, her back to me, draped in a moth-eaten shawl. She rocked slowly in a child's high chair. "Do you have the money?" she rasped without turning. I handed her a crumpled 20 and the portrait. She accepted it, then held it out. "You'll need this," she said, pressing a small pewter key into my palm. The key was intricately carved of the shape of a gallows noose. "Don't lose it." I thanked her and hurried home uneasy. I set the painting on my workbench and examined it under a bright lamp. The gentleman's eyes seemed to glint in the glare, and I felt a cold prickle crawl down my spine. I shrugged, determined to start the repair. That night, I dreamed of crashing waves, and that gentleman rising from his chair pistols, drawn his tailcoat flapping like wings. I woke with a start, sweat soaking my shirt. My phone read 3:03 a.m. I glanced at the portrait on the bench. His eyes stared straight at me, and his mouth, it seemed to curve into a faint, satisfied smile. Over the next day, I cleaned the cracked glass and gently scrubbed grime from the frame. I planned to patch the canvas tears and seal the paint layer. At one point, while I sanded a flake of gilding, I noticed a new detail, the noose key carved into the gentleman's waistcoat pocket in the fresh paint. It hadn't been there before. My breath caught. I tapped the canvas, nothing moved. But when I looked again, the key had shifted now, dangling against his thigh, as if he'd just pressed it there. Panic spun in my chest. I backed away. I slammed on gloves and scraped the spot clean white canvas showed beneath. Then I heard a creak behind me. I spun. The woman in the parlor rocker stood in my doorway, though I was alone in my workshop downtown. She rocked back and forth, shawl swaying. "He needs the key," she crooned. "Return it to him." I shook my head. "Who are you?" My voice trembled. She tilted her head, eyes milky. "The husband," she whispered, "hung for his crimes in 1889. He'll be obliged if you return what's his." I recoiled. "What crimes?" She clicked her tongue. "Murdered his family at sea. Left their bodies chained to the mast." She leaned forward. "Now he waits for a final heir to deliver the last lock. Then he can rest." She faded like smoke. I stumbled back. My throat closed. I glanced at the portrait. The gentleman sat straighter, shoulders squared, gaze fixed on me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my apartment, listening to distant cars. At 2:17 a.m., my phone lit up with an alert camera detected movement workshop. I bolted upright. My security rig was monitoring the shop. I grabbed my keys and drove over. The workshop was locked from the inside. I forced the door open to find the portrait missing. Empty hooks on the wall. On the bench lay the pewter key. Beneath it, in fresh red paint, someone had scrawled, "I have it now. Release us." I yanked the key up. It felt heavy in my hand, like a chunk of lead. The noose was sharp. I stared at it, mind racing. I knew what I had to do. Back at home, I wiped sweat from my brow and retrieved the painting from the passenger seat. Moonlight poured through the window as I set it on the floorboards. I inserted the key into the gentleman's painted pocket just above the noose he'd worn. It fit perfectly. The moment I turned it, the canvas shivered. A wind whipped through the room, though no window was open. The painting rippled, and I smelled brine and decay. The man in the portrait leaned forward, lips moving in a silent hiss. A faint click sounded like the turning of a lock. Then everything went still. The waves in the seascape calmed. The gentleman's eyes softened. His mouth relaxed into a peaceful line. The key fell from the canvas and landed with a dull thud. I backed away, heart hammering. The painting sagged as if relieved of a weight. Silence filled the room. Morning found me on the floor, staring at the portrait propped against the wall. For the first time, his gaze avoided mine. His hands rested on his lap. The noose was nowhere to be seen. I slipped the key into my pocket, planning to discard it far from home. But when I withdrew it later, I saw the noose carved deeper than before, fresh etchings around the ring. And in the mirror's reflection, at the edge of my vision, I caught the faint outline of a high-backed chair rocking gently. I never did return the key. I keep it locked in a small safe. The portrait still hangs in my workshop, now simply an odd antique. I tell clients it's a restored piece from the 19th century, nothing more. But sometimes, late at night, I walk past it and swear. I see the gentleman glance over his shoulder, eyes mournful, as if still watching for the final heir. I can't shake the feeling that I owe him one more turn of the key, and that perhaps until I do the seas will never be calm, and his restless spirit will keep seeking release one shadow at a time. I'd been hunting for greenery to brighten up my drab apartment when I stumbled across the Craigslist post-free rare Monstera deliciosa pickup only. The photo showed a massive glossy-leafed plant trailing out of a cracked terracotta pot. I messaged the poster and arranged to haul it home that evening. When I arrived, the house was a modest bungalow with an unkempt yard. The front door was ajar. Inside, every surface, shelves, tables, even the stair rails, was covered in pots of various sizes, all overrun with vines and leaves. In the center of the living room stood the Monstera, its fronds stretching toward the ceiling. A middle-aged woman with soil-stained hands wiped sweat from her brow as I entered. "Thanks for coming," she said, voice warm but strained. "I've run out of space." She's thirsty and needs a new home. She handed me a pair of worn gardening gloves and a heavy clay pot. "Be careful, she's thirsty." Her eyes flicked toward the plant's dark, hollow crotches, where the stems met the aerial roots. "And watch your hands." I lugged the pot to my car with surprising ease, though the twisting vines snagged my jacket. I braced it in the back seat, the leaves brushing the headliner. On the drive home, I peered at the fronds through the rearview mirror. They seemed to twitch, as if reaching. In my apartment, I settled the plant in a sunny corner and watered it. The soil slurped the water hungrily. I patted it dry and stepped back, admiring the lush green. For the first time in months, my living room felt alive. That night, I dreamt of thick vines wrapping around my ankles, tugging me down into a dark, fertile soil where something whispered beneath the earth. I awakened to find the air heavy, humid. The Monstera's leaves were pressed against my bedroom doorway, curling around the frame. I blinked, disoriented, and the leaves fell back into place. Over the next week, the plant grew with ruthless speed. One morning, I woke to find a new leaf unfurled overnight, a massive split Monstera leaf that brushed the ceiling. Beneath it, near the soil, I found a single fingerprint pressed into the dirt, too small for an adult, too large for a child. I shook the thought away as absurd. I trimmed a few tendrils that reached into the walkway, but the cuts bled thick, dark sap that smelled of rotten citrus. Later that day, I discovered scratch marks on my walls, 4 parallel gouges ascending toward the ceiling like talon marks. I snapped photos, considering deterrence, but by evening, the marks had faded, leaving only faint silvery scars. That night, I heard rustling in the apartment. I sat up and listened, soft, impatient brushing, like something sliding across the hardwood floor. I flicked on the lamp. The Monstera's vines had crept across the floor in a sinuous line toward my bedroom. My heart hammered. I grabbed pruning shears and lunged at the nearest tendril, but it recoiled, snapping away like a whip. The leaves trembled as if alive. I backed out of reach. The plant quivered, then settled. I snapped a few photos of the crawling vines and posted them on a gardening forum with a panicked caption. "Is this normal Monstera behavior?" The only reply I received was a direct message at 3:17 a.m. No name. Just one line. "She's hungry." I bolted upright. My phone screen went black. I flicked the lights on and off, testing bulbs. Everything else worked. The room was silent, too silent. Then I heard a soft creak from the hallway. I tiptoed to the door and cracked it. In the living room, the monstera's vines wrapped around my coffee table, anchored the pot itself by lashing aerial roots into the floorboards. The pot swayed as if the plant were shifting its weight. I leaned closer. In the soil, I saw something unexpected. A small, pale handprint, like the outline of a child's palm, pressed firmly into the earth. I touched the imprint, cool to my fingertips. My skin prickled. I drew back. Over the next 2 days, I barely slept. I set up my phone to record the monstera at night. When I reviewed the footage, I saw it clearly around 2 a.m. The vines moved in waves. Leaves stirred. The vines coiled around the pot's rim, then slithered off onto the floor. The camera caught a dark figure crouched in the corner of the frame, a child face buried in shadows tracing the plant's vines with tiny fingers. I froze the video on a single frame. The figure looked up. One eye gleaming white, the other hidden. Its mouth curved upward in a ragged smile. A vine draped over its shoulder like a shawl. I felt sick. I tried to show the footage to friends, but their faces blurred whenever I pulled out my phone. Instead of my recording, they saw a still image of an empty room. On the third night, I woke to soft giggles echoing through my apartment. I stumbled into the living room. The monstera's vines had reached my sofa, curling over the cushions like a protective arm. On the seat cushion lay a child's doll missing an eye, dressed in tattered linen. Its head tilted toward the plant as if listening. I knelt to pick it up. The doll's sole remaining eye reflected the monstera's glossy green leaf. Music began to drift from nowhere, a lullaby in a child's voice. I stood backing away, almost tripping over a vine that had crept under my slipper. The lullaby rose in pitch. Feed me, feed me, feed me, Visi. I dropped the doll and ran to my bedroom, slamming the door. I propped my dresser against it and pressed my back against the wall. Through the door crack, I heard a slow scraping, one vine extending inch by inch across the wood, and beneath it, a child's laughter. I stayed there until dawn. When the first gray light filtered through the curtains, the scraping stopped. The dresser had shifted a few inches. The vine had vanished. I dared to open the door. No vine, no doll. But the monstera's fronds pressed against the ceiling, and the soil in the pot was scuffed, as if something had been dug out. I knew what I had to do. I grabbed a shovel and drove to a nearby plant nursery, traded it for a flowering philodendron. I returned home, repotted the monstera into a large plastic bin, then carried it down to a secluded section of the city park in the early morning light. I buried it deep, covering the pot and the vine mat with earth. I stomped the soil flat, promising myself and whatever was entwined in its roots that I'd never look back. That night, I slept without waking once. But at 3:13 a.m., I sat bolt upright to the sound of a child's voice whispering through my window. Plant me here. I peered outside. Moonlight glinted on something pale in the flower bed by the window. A single monstera leaf, impossibly fresh, veined with resinous sap. I pressed my forehead against the glass as a slow breeze rattled the leaves of my philodendron on the balcony. And somewhere, just beyond the wall of my apartment, I heard the softest giggle of a child, hungry, triumphant, still alive in soil I'd thought I had buried. I first saw the ad on a slow Sunday afternoon free aluminum canoe must haul away. I was living on the lake shore at the time and had always dreamed of gliding out over dawn mist, fishing rod in hand. For $0, I figured I couldn't go wrong. I messaged the poster and arranged to pick it up that evening. The address was at the dead end of a winding dirt road where the forest pressed in close. A lone porch light flickered, illuminating a battered trailer. I honked twice and a figure emerged, a man in a faded life jacket, his face gaunt and sunburned. He nodded at the canoe propped against the trailer's rusting steps. "Careful," he said, voice low. "She's a handful." He glanced toward the dark tree line. "Takes more water than buoyancy." I shrugged and set to work hoisting the canoe onto my roof rack. Its bottom was scratched, warped in places, and I felt it flex unnaturally under my grip. The man watched in silence until I climbed behind the wheel. "Enjoy her," he called as I pulled away. "She'll take you where you need to be." That night, I dreamt of being on the water mist, all around soundless, except for soft lapping. My paddle touched the surface, and the world went dark. I woke at dawn, heart pounding, but the sky was clear. I packed my gear rod tackle box thermos and drove to the public boat launch. The lake lay glassy at sunrise, reeds swaying at the edge. I secured the canoe to the trailer hitch and walked it down the ramp. The aluminum hull was surprisingly light in the water. I climbed in, settled on the slatted bench, and pushed off. The paddle carved silence. I drifted past cattails and lily pads. The lake was so still, I felt I could hear my own blood pulsing. The farther I glided, the thicker the mist became until the shore vanished behind me. I found a quiet cove and anchored by a cluster of birch trees. I cast my line and watched the ripples expand. Time passed with gentle swaying, no tug, no bite. I dozed in the heavy fog lulled by the water's gentle rocking. When I opened my eyes, the mist had thickened into a wall. I couldn't see my hands at the end of my arms. My heart sank. I reached for my phone, but it was off the bench on the canoe floor. I slid my hand across the aluminum. It was slick, covered in dew-like beads that stung at my fingertips. I found the phone, but no signal. I tapped the screen, dead battery. I flicked on my flashlight. The mist blazed white, then revealed a muddy shoreline a few yards away. Relief surged through me. I could paddle back. I stood and lifted the canoe's nose to turn it shoreward. That's when I noticed footprints in the mud. Single file space just wide enough for one boot. They led off through the reeds and disappeared into the haze. They were fresh, no fallen leaves or moss disturbed around them. My skin crawled. Footsteps on the shore meant someone else was here. I scanned the tree line, but all I saw was gray mist and the dark silhouette of birches. I bent down to grab my paddle and heard a splash behind me. The canoe's stern rocked violently, water sluicing in through a gash I hadn't noticed. The hull had split along a seam flooding the back half. I scrambled forward as cold water rose soaking my legs. The canoe listed dangerously. Panic seized me. I leapt to shore, dragging the canoe until it grounded. It clattered onto the sand. I turned to face the lake. No mist, no hills, just reeds and quivering fog. The canoe floated 3 feet offshore empty. My hands shook as I retrieved the paddle. I planted it near the canoe, intending to haul it to my vehicle later. I crossed my arms against the chill and took a cautious step toward the water and froze. There, a few yards off, I saw the canoe again. This time, filled with someone sitting perfectly still, head bowed, motionless. No paddle, no sign of movement. My breath shook. The outlines were blurred by fog, but I could make out a life jacket and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. I swallowed throat dry. "Hey," I called, voice brittle. No response. Just the mist settling around the figure like a curtain. My rational mind screamed that it was my reflection, my arriving shadow. But that canoe was at the edge of the willows, and my own was grounded behind me. I stumbled backward. A snap of a twig echoed from the tree line, a deliberate crisp sound. Someone was out there watching. I scrambled over gnarled roots back toward the dirt road. Mid-reach way to the launch, the air grew cold, as if the sun had been blotted out. I dared a glance behind me. The mist churned, revealing the same figure now halfway to shore, gliding toward me, hat low jacket, stiff arms unmoving. The water rippled around that canoe like ink and water. My heart thundered as I ran. My boots slipped in the damp earth. The paddle trailed where I dropped it unreachable. I burst onto the ramp and flipped the switch to retract my trailer. It groaned, lifting the canoe gradually. My arms ached as I wrestled it into place. Finally, I latched it and backed quickly down the ramp, engine roaring in protest. As I passed the spot where I'd beached earlier, I saw movement in the fog. Another canoe drifting aimlessly. Its occupant slumped forward, face hidden. I floored the gas tires, splashing shallow puddles along the ramp. The mist thinned as I climbed the dirt road. Behind me in the rearview mirror, I saw nothing but the boat, under moonlight, rattling on its trailer. Back home, I spilled onto the porch chest, heaving. I undid the rack straps and lifted the canoe aside, balancing it on its end. The gash was deeper than I thought, half the hull sliced through, and I saw scratch marks along the split, like talons dragged the metal apart. I unlatched my hatchback and shoved the canoe inside, squeezing it between my camping gear and winter coats. Dawn's first light fell on the aluminum. In its reflection, I thought I saw a face at the window, a pale face staring in lips pressed tight. I flinched and closed the hatch. Inside, it was dark and cramped. I sat in the driver's seat, heart-pounding flashlight illuminating the cavernous interior. The paddle lay across the passenger seat, slick with moisture. Beside it, the old man's life jacket from the pickup. A life jacket I'd never owned, its straps frayed, its orange faded to rust. I grabbed the life jacket, but the inside was stiff and heavy. When I shook it, I heard something rattle, tiny stones, or maybe pebbles. But as I shone my light inside, I saw something else. A small porcelain figurine, soaked nestled among the vest's folds. It was a boy in a tiny sailor suit, arms outstretched, face frozen in a scream. I bolted from the car, dropping the jacket and figurine onto the gravel. The hatch clicked shut behind me, sealing the canoe in darkness. I watched my SUV gleam in dawn light. Then, without looking back, I walked away. That afternoon, I listed the canoe on Craigslist myself. Free aluminum, canoe, must haul away, minor damage. In the photo, I took care to hide the deep gash, the claw-like scratches, and I left the paddle behind. No mention of the life jacket or the mystery figure. I never went back to the lake. But sometimes I drive past the ramp at dusk, and if I pause long enough, I see another canoe drifting in the mist, pale silhouette empty of life, gliding silent as a ghost. and sometimes in the corner of the reflected metal, I glimpsed the boy in sailor suit, tiny arms outstretched, still screaming. I'd been fascinated by the night sky since childhood. So when I saw the ad on Craigslist vintage refractor telescope, free to good home, I jumped at the chance. The photos showed a gleaming brass tube on a wooden tripod patina just starting to bloom in the joints. The seller said it once belonged to an amateur astronomer in the 1920s who vanished under mysterious circumstances. A bit of legend only sweetened the deal. That afternoon, I drove out to a silent ranch-style house on the outskirts of town. The mailboxes were rusted, the lawn overgrown. I rang the bell. No answer. I knocked on the door. It opened on a creak, revealing a narrow hallway lined with dusty blinds. At the end stood a tall man with silver hair and sunken cheeks. He wore a thin cardigan and half smiled. "You here for the telescope?" he asked, voice soft as moth wings. I nodded. He led me through a cramped living room to a glass-paned sunroom at the back. There it was, the brass refractor gleaming in a shaft of late afternoon light. I ran my fingers over the mountings, cold, sturdy. "She's yours," he said, his gaze fixed on some distant point outside. "But be careful what you point her at." I fetched my hatchback from the driveway and wrestled the tripod and tube into the back seat. The seller watched from the doorway, expression unreadable. "Keep her covered," he said, "and never look through her after midnight." I laughed it off. Who'd ever need to look past midnight? But I couldn't resist loading her onto the porch that evening. I wiped the lenses clean, set the tripod beneath the skylight of my attic, and waited for darkness. When the sky turned indigo and the first stars pricked out, I climbed the narrow stairs, telescope in hand. I peered through the eyepiece at Orion's belt, swept past Sirius to the Pleiades, every sight crisp and bright. Then on a whim, I slid the declination knob east, searching the faint scrub of stars for something new. I caught it suddenly, a smudge of light drifting across the field of view. It pulsed rhythmic like a distant heartbeat. I focused and realized it wasn't a star cluster, but the silhouette of something vast moving against the starfield. A dark tendril coiled around Aldebaran, masking the ruby glow. I blinked and reeled back. No moving objects should appear at that scale. I swallowed, heart racing, and refocused on the moon to steady myself. Through the eyepiece, the crater rims gleamed, but in one shadowed basin, I saw a flicker of movement, something slithering along the crater floor, too sinuous for any natural feature. I backed away, shaken. Midnight approached. I remembered the seller's warning. Still curiosity gnawed. At 12:03 a.m., I scrolled the telescope until the smudge reappeared, drifting across Ursa Major. I followed it as it crawled past Dubhe toward Polaris. It was enormous, bigger than a planet, darker than the void, its shape indistinct, as if woven from shadow itself. And then I realized it was watching me. Through the eyepiece, I felt eyes boring into my soul. The shadow paused, then unfurled a tendril toward Earth. My breath seized. I gasped, and the eyepiece swarmed with static, a rasping hiss vibrating through the metal tube. I yanked my eye away. Behind me, the skylight cracked. A wave of cold wind rushed down, tossing dust across the floor. The telescope, I swear, wobbled as if someone had bumped it. I bolted down the stairs, heart hammering, leaving the instrument trained on the sky. I spent the next day in a fog. My friends joked about my crazy stargazing. I shrugged it off, but each evening I felt the pull of the telescope calling me back. Finally, I promised myself one last look before sundown. I carried it back upstairs, wiped the eyepiece, and centered on Vega. The star was steady and bright. I let out a breath. But then I felt a kinesthetic flutter, like the telescope itself was alive, prowling the sky. My fingers tightened on the focusing knob. The eyepiece swung past Vega, settling on a blank patch of void where no star chart marked anything. I hesitated. Then I peered through. I saw fields of dead stars, fractured constellations I'd never heard of, lines of emptiness where galaxies had been. At the center, an eye vast and lidless swirled in violet and black. It blinked. I reeled back and nearly fell. The attic door slammed downstairs with a thunderclap. I scrambled to lift the tripod, but the telescope slid away as if resisting me. I lunged to stop it. My fingers brushed the cold brass, and I heard a voice low and rasping, "Monkey sees." I staggered out of the attic, slammed the door, and collapsed at the foot. The voice echoed, "Monkey knows." I scrambled for a lamp, but the attic light was off. The darkness pressed against the door. I ran out of the house, leaving the telescope behind. In the cobalt sky, Orion's belt glowed normally unremarkable. I watched helplessly as the attic window reflected only my pallid face and the empty porch. The next morning, I drove back. I bit my lip, determined to reclaim the telescope for proof, though part of me hoped it had vanished. The house was empty, dark. I crept inside to the attic door. It was ajar. The telescope stood where I'd left it mounted and pointed at the skylight. But the eyepiece was gone, twisted off, and missing. I examined the mount. The declination and RA knobs were seized as if someone or something had locked them in place. The tube pointed straight up. I heard that rasp again. "Look up," I swallowed. But I knew better than to obey. I backed away, my stomach roiling. I dropped the tripod, fled the house, and shoved the door closed. I never returned for the missing piece. Now, months later, sometimes in the dead of night, I feel a tug at the back of my skull, a cold pull toward the stars. And I know that somewhere beyond our sky, that shadow watches through my missing eyepiece, waiting until I can't resist anymore, until I point the telescope back upward and see what no earthly mind can bear. I first bought Kitsong, spotted the listing late. One evening, free antique music box plays on winding key, pickup only. The photos showed a small walnut box inlaid with mother-of-pearl flowers, its brass winding key glinting in the light. The seller claimed it belonged to a long-abandoned estate upstate, no name, no backstory. I loved mechanical curiosities, so I emailed immediately. The next afternoon, I drove to a ramshackle farmhouse set back from the road. The peeling green paint clung to rotting wood, and tall grass bowed under its own weight. I knocked on the battered screen door. A thin woman in paint-spattered overalls answered her, hair pulled back in a messy bun. She led me through a cluttered living room to a small glass display case where the music box sat. "Careful," she warned, her voice hushed. "It doesn't just play tunes." I paid her nothing and lifted the box gingerly. It was surprisingly heavy. Winding keys taped inside. She pointed to a scrap of masking to tape on the lid. Wins 3 full turns, then stops itself. Don't force it. I nodded, eager to see it in action, and loaded it into my car. That night, I set the box on my mantle, brushed off a thin film of dust, and wound the key clockwise until it clicked. The lid popped open, revealing a tiny ballerina perched on a circular platform. As the gears engaged, a plaintive, tinkling melody floated out like distant church bells at twilight. The ballerina spun slowly, her silk skirt rustling against the brass pins beneath. I watched entranced until the music faltered at the 30-second mark. The tune stuttered and then shifted into something warped a minor key I didn't recognize. The ballerina's head tilted oddly, as if searching the dim room. Then the melody stuttered again, the last note trailing off into silence. The box locked itself key still at the ready. I smiled at the novelty and went to bed. At 2:17 a.m., I awoke to the faintest echo of that melody, like a music box ghost drifting down the hallway. I rubbed my eyes and slipped out of bed. The living room was empty, no ballerina, no music. I crept toward the mantel. The key was gone. A jangling noise drew me to the kitchen. The key lay on the counter, spinning slowly on its axis. I scooped it up. Behind me, the music began again. Slow, mournful plinks. I whirled. The ballerina stood on the coffee table, way too large now, nearly a foot tall, her skirt torn paint peeling from her wooden limbs. My heart caught. I backed away, stomach clenching. She tilted her head and lifted one painted arm as though beckoning. The melody paused, then resumed, drawn out, deeper, resonant. I stifled a scream, dropped the key, and fled back to my bedroom, slamming the door behind me. Over the next few days, I tested the box obsessively. Every time the tune shifted, sometimes fast and joyful, other times slow and dirge-like. Each winding produced subtle changes in the ballerina's posture. Her arms drooped, head bowed, skirt stained. On the 4th winding, I noticed a scratch on her wooden cheek, like a fingernail gouge. That night, I dreamt I was dancing alone in an empty ballroom. The floorboards groaned beneath my feet. The chandeliers swayed, and the music box's tune echoed from every corner. I awoke to whispered giggles in the darkness. My door creaked open. Illuminated by streetlight, the ballerina stood at the threshold, holding out a tiny porcelain hand. I bolted out of bed. When I returned to the living room, the box lay on the floor. Burst open, the ballerina gone. The inlay on the lid was scratched away in a perfect ring, and the platform pivot had been wrenched from its socket. In its place lay a strand of golden hair. Panic rose. I packed the box and ballerina into a cardboard shipping crate, planning to return them to the farmhouse. At dawn, I lifted the crate into my hatchback and drove 2 hours north. The farmhouse looked even sadder in gray morning light. I set the crate on the porch and rang the bell. No answer. I tried the doorknob. It turned. Inside, the house was frozen in time. Dust motes hung in the air. Faded wallpaper, peeled in long ribbons, and an empty cradle rocked slowly in the corner. I heard a soft drip, drip, drip from the back room. My heart pounded as I edged forward. In the kitchen, the farmhouse owner stood with her back to me, her hair fraying like roots. The crate sat at her feet, empty. She turned slowly, and I saw it. Her face was featureless, blank wood grain, where eyes and mouth should be. Behind her, a melody began, sweet, sorrowful, unmistakable. The music box tune rose from every cracked floorboard and warped wall panel. I spun to see the ballerina dancing on the stove, then on the windowsill, then on the steps. She multiplied until every surface bore a tiny dancer, all spinning in perfect, sorrowful unison. I ran. The front door slammed behind me. The melody chased me down the porch steps, echoing across the overgrown yard. I vaulted into my car and sped away, the tune shuddering in my brain. Back home, I destroyed the crate. I burned the box in my fireplace, its wood crackling and weeping as the fire consumed it. I thought the ballerina vanished with the smoke. That night, sleep eluded me. Around midnight, I heard plinking from the mantel. I crept downstairs. There on the dust-blackened hearth sat the ballerina, smaller than before, half-charred, still spinning to a melody no longer in my memory. Her cracked wooden arm extended toward me, and in her tiny painted eye, I saw my own reflection, glossy and wide with dread. I backed away, heart pounding, and slipped out the front door into the chill October night. Behind me, the tiny song echoed through the house, slow, seductive, and utterly relentless. Hello everyone, I'm ZiBo, and thank you so much for watching until the very end of this video. I truly hope today's stories brought you some enjoyable moments. If you found them helpful, don't forget to leave a comment down below. Every bit of your feedback helps me improve and continue creating quality content. See you in the next video.